Hi, welcome to Chapter 11, Part 1. We're breaking this down into a couple of sections because the chapter is rather lengthy. For this module, you'll need to read pages 258 through 275. We start with an image of the storming of Bastille, which happened on January 14th, 1789. It's just a picture for you to take a look at. And I have no idea why this says not for sale at the top. So apparently this timetable is not for sale, but it's there for your convenience if you like timetables. It just walks you through the basic elements of this chapter. Let's start by talking about the old regime. The old regime was made up of 3 estates. We'll talk about those individually. Basically, easy to remember, the regimes were the first estate, second estate, and third estate. The first estate was made up of clergy. Now, the church owned about 10% of the land, so you would think that they would draw quite a lot of revenue in from that land. However, the church, as a member of the first estate, did not pay taxes. So then you have the second estate, which was nobility. These were the people that held the highest positions, and they too were exempt from most taxes. They owned anywhere from 25 to 33% of the land. So the third estate included everything else. People who weren't clergy members, people who weren't members of the nobility. So they had about 20% of the land, and they had some wealth. The bourgeoisie had some wealth, but they lacked that social prestige that came with the first 2 estates. They weren't nobility, they weren't clergy, they were business owners, merchants, bankers, that sort of thing. People that we generally think of today as maybe being first or upper class were actually in the third estate with everyone else. You know, the peasants were included in the third estate, but the bourgeoisie didn't have that social status. They did, however, have plenty of taxes. So let's talk briefly about the peasants in the old regime. They were a little better off than the Eastern European serfs, but their poverty was worsening, and that's because even though they had a large amount of land, they had to pay taxes on it. So there was barely enough left for them to get by. Now, you'll note on the slide that peasants owned 30 to 40% of land. However, it's important to know that there were a lot of peasants, so the land that they divided up among them wasn't that great. So you didn't have a lot of room for crop rotation, that sort of thing that really builds your land and makes your farming better or that sort of thing. So people were barely getting by. The birth rate was rising, so it meant more mouths to feed, and people who didn't have land to work resorted to begging. The tax collectors really victimized the peasantry, and they did that in order to pay for the royal agenda. Of course, you know, the clergy, the nobility are not paying taxes, generally speaking. So that leaves the peasantry to pay for a royal or regal way of life for royalty, which obviously isn't fair. We can hear that today. Maybe they knew it then, maybe they didn't, but we will find out as we discuss things further that the peasants did realize that, and they made a way for change. So we talked about how inefficient farming methods contributed to poverty. When you've got that much land, split it up among that many people, there's just not enough for crop rotation or maybe even good water supply, that sort of thing. The really bad harvest from 1788 to 1789 caused the price of bread to really increase, which caused more misery. And of course, these people aren't going to Walmart or going to Brookshire's or Safeway or Target or anywhere to buy a loaf of bread. I mean, they're growing the grain in order to process it and make the bread themselves. So even that with that poor harvest, it really caused bread to be in shortfall. And the hatred of all of this, obviously, and their doom to poverty caused peasant revolution in 1789. Also, in the old regime, in that third estate, were some union laborers. These were journeymen, craftsmen, day laborers that made up the urban working class. They were, today we would consider electricians and plumbers and, you know, everybody that we need for life in that section. Of course, there weren't electricians then, so keep that in mind. But anyway, those are the kind of jobs that we're talking about. From 1785 to 1789, the cost of living rose 62%, while that's hard to say, while wages increased only 22%. You can see that that's not a good balance at all. The urban workers faced horrible food shortages, and honestly, it drove them to acts of violence. Maybe stealing in order to, provide food for the family and that sort of thing. So obviously the old regime was not working. It was inefficient and frankly kind of weird the way it was set up. So 18th century France had an absolute monarch, but it was confusing because they had the monarch administration, they had conflicting laws and codes based on Roman law and feudal law. It just didn't work. Then the financial disorder that came from it also added to the weakness of the old regime. You know, you've got two estates, the first and second estate, that are living rather high on the hog, and you have peasants who are paying their way. So, if the monarchy and the first two estates don't get to live high enough on that hog, they're going to keep taxing, taxing, taxing. Obviously, the peasantry got tired of it. The third estate rose up and called for change. There were only a few people paying taxes, and only a few wealthy people, I should say, that were paying taxes. And the king's ministers proposed that nobility and the church surrender some tax privileges. But the nobility naturally resisted that in 1788 and called for the Estates General to meet. And the nobles intended to weaken the power of the throne, but this led to some unexpected consequences, which opened the way for destroying the old regime and creating revolution. So let's talk about the way the Enlightenment and the American Revolution impacted the old regime. Had a big impact. Many historians today connect the Enlightenment and the French Revolution because revolutionary leaders used philosophes' ideas in order to attack old order, and that's both in the American colonies and in the French Revolution. They used ideas like liberty and fairness, freedom, those sorts of things to develop, in our case, the Declaration of Independence, and in the case of France, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And Americans set an example of social equality without hereditary aristocracy. So basically, for the first time that, people have really paid attention to, France sees that the United States, at the time, the colonies, America, had been established without one leader, one monarch. We had a democracy that was inspiring to them. So recent historians dispute the idea, though, that the French Revolution was an episode in rise of the bourgeoisie, because France didn't have an identifiable bourgeois class distinct from the nobles back in 1789. We look back at it now, we see it, we reflect upon it that way, but at the time, the third estate was the third estate. There wasn't an upper third estate, a lower third estate, although we may see it that way now. That's not how it was identified at the time. Oh, and I thought this cartoon was cute. It's called Let's Hope That Game Finishes Well. The political cartoon shows a laborer, which is right here, this guy, who is obviously worn down. He's got a cane here and just trying to get by. And he's carrying rich, privileged people on his back. And this political cartoon really shows what the estates were like. It's a good depiction of the first, second, and third estate. So the moderate stage was from 1789 to 1791, and there was a clash then between the nobility and the third estate. The electoral assemblies elected deputies to estates general. Each estate drew up a list of grievances and suggestions. This is called the, hang on just a minute, I've got to get my pronunciation sheet over here. I want to make sure I say it right. I did not take French, I took German, so anyway. Cahiers de doléances, which means Book of Grievances. And in many differences, both the nobility and the urban bourgeoisie called for the National Assembly to approve taxation, a written constitution, financial reforms including no tax exemptions, a guarantee of personal liberty, and freedom of press. And if you look at those, and if you've studied our own American Constitution at all, you can see the very close similarities. So in the moderate state, many nobles were becoming sympathetic to reform, and there wasn't really a big divide between the second and third estates. You remember previously we discussed that at a point they wanted to start taxing some of the nobility, so that really kind of gave them something in common with the third estate. Ultimately, it was clear that the reformers' hopes clashed with the aristocratic intentions. Conflict between the two privileged orders on one side, the clergy and the nobility, because the nobility did not want to be taxed, so they had that conflict going on, and then conflict with the third estate created quite some turmoil. The issue of representation in estates general triggered conflict between the third estate and other orders. So we have now the formation of the National Assembly. The Estates General convened at Versailles on May 5th, 1789. Nobility insisted on meeting and voting separately. The third estate was concerned that the first and second would vote together, though, and overrule the third estate, which had a greater number of delegates. On June 17th, the third estate declared itself National Assembly. On June 20th, they were locked out of the customary meeting hall, so the third estate delegates convened in a nearby indoor tennis court. They swore not to disband until a constitution had been drawn up for France. Louis XVI commanded the National Assembly to separate into orders, but the third estate refused. On June 27th, Louis yielded and ordered the nobility and clergy to join the third estate. So they held out and they got what they needed. Most nobles reversed positions of previous years and joined with the king to crush the National Assembly. Louis ordered special foreign regiments on the outskirts of Paris and Versailles because the use of force seemed likely. In July 1789, tension was high in Paris, and calling of the Estates General raised hopes for reform, but the price of bread was soaring. By 1789, laborers spent 80% of their income on bread. Can you imagine 80% of your income being spent on bread? Fearing aristocratic plot, the citizens searched for weapons. And then on July 14th, about 900 Parisians gathered at Bastille, which was a fortress prison, and acquired gunpowder and removed cannons. The governor of Bastille ordered the men to fire on the crowd. The crowd killed the governor, 5 of his men, and paraded their heads on pikes through Paris. We talked about that before, right? Chapter 10, I believe. Robespierre and his guys were, parading the heads around town. Anyway, same thing happens at Bastille. The crowd was made up of small tradesmen, artisans, and wage earners. Bastille became a symbol of the old regime despotism, which is absolute power, usually cruel. Its fall was crucial to the revolutionary acts that came about and saved the National Assembly and bourgeois revolution. So let's talk about the Great Fear. Uh, the Parisians' uprising strengthened the National Assembly and reformers, as did countryside uprisings. So, revolt begets revolt. Peasants began to burn manor houses and destroy registers of their obligations. So, any kind of contracts that they had signed with landowners, they started to burn them. Rumors that aristocrats were organizing brigades to attack also triggered this great fear among the peasantry. Convinced that the aristocrats would block reforms, peasants attacked the nobles with fury. And if just a note here, if you notice that I'm having a hard time saying aristocrats, it's because I'm a Disney fan, so it's really hard not to say aristocats. So anyway, bear with me on that. On August 4th, 1789, trying to restore calm in the countryside, the aristocrats surrendered special privileges. And then on August 26th, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen as a preface to its Constitution. And, we have women's marches today. Just wanted to point out to you that women marched at Versailles as well. The bread shortage and those high prices sparked the protest march of thousands of women to Versailles in October of 1789. The king was compelled to return to Paris, and which was a sign of his diminishing power, and many aristocrats were hostile to the revolution and fled the country. Okay, we're going to talk fake news here for a minute. Don't believe every meme you see. I love them. I know you love them. Memes are everywhere, and they're a lot of fun. But when you walk into a party holding a birthday cake and you shout, "Let them eat cake," it's coming from folklore that says Marie Antoinette replied, "Let them eat cake," when she found out that the peasants had no bread. So obviously, if they didn't have bread, they didn't have cake. So it was a sign of noble aloofness and disconnect, for lack of a better word. Obviously, they had no cake. But the truth is, there's no proof that she said that. There has been some citation that shows that it could have been written by Rousseau many years before she was queen. Anyway, just wanted to point that out to you. Okay, back to the moderate estate. Let's talk about the October days. Louis XVI did not approve August decrees or the Declaration of the Rights of Man. On October 5th, 1789, Paris housewives and men marched on Versailles, that picture that I just showed you a couple slides back, to protest the lack of bread. They were joined by Paris guards, 20,000 members of citizen militia. Louis was afraid of more violence and approved decrees and the declaration. The nobles who tried to block reforms fled from France in large numbers, and they saw the writing on the wall. So this depicts the execution of Louis XVI. He died with dignity. His last words were, "I forgive my enemies. I trust that my death will be for the happiness of my people, but I grieve for France, and I fear that she may suffer the anger of the Lord." All right, back to the moderate stage. Reforms of the National Assembly. Special privileges were abolished, so that meant that everyone paid taxes. The Statement of Human Rights expressed liberal, universal goals of different philosophies that were of particular interest to the bourgeoisie, proclaimed inalienable rights to liberty of a person, freedom of religion, equality under law, and affirmed the dignity of an individual. And this has been called the death warrant of the old regime. And as far as subordination of church to state, the National Assembly struck at privileges of the Catholic Church, ending tithes. Now, we have the option to pay tithes today, and it's not required. Back then in France, it was required. It also confiscated and sold church lands. In 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy altered the boundaries of the diocese and reduced the numbers of bishops and priests, which transformed the clergy into government officials elected by people and paid by the state. Big change there. So that brings us to a constitution for France. In September 1791, a constitution limited the power of the king. It established equal treatment for all French citizens under law. It created a legislative assembly, a unicameral parliament, una meaning one and cameral meaning house, so a one-house parliament which would succeed the National Assembly. And illiterate men and men without property couldn't vote or enact legislation, but their voting privileges in France by constitution were more generous than those in Britain at the time. The standardized system of courts from the old regime were replaced, and the sale of judicial offices was ended, and a new penal code abolished torture and barbaric treatment. So National Assembly ended all tolls and duties on goods that were transported within the country and established a tariff to protect French manufacturers, insisting that French colonies trade only with France. So they built their economy by keeping it within their economy. They established a uniform system of weights and measures for France and eliminated guilds, forbade workers to form unions or to strike. So obviously that's a limit of a freedom in a way. However, at the time it helped them build their business. The National Assembly consolidated the rule of the bourgeoisie. It wasn't selfish, and it was not only a selfish expression of bourgeoisie interest. The Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen proclaimed liberty and equality for everyone, not just the bourgeoisie, but everyone. These ideals became the core of liberal democratic credo that spread throughout the West in the 19th century. That brings us to the radical stage. The sans-culottes, the discontent of the sans-culottes, who were the shopkeepers, artisans, etc., propelled the revolution towards radicalism. They gained very little and foresaw that the bourgeoisie would succeed the fallen aristocracy. So the sans-culottes demanded increased wages, price controls on food, and to punish food profiteers, etc. By the end of 1792, the sans-culottes were demanding equality with bourgeoisie. So now let's talk about the radical stage. Revolution might not have become radical if France had remained at peace, but war broke out with Austria and Prussia in April of 1792. It was exacerbated with internal dissension. Some people wanted to be at war, some people didn't. It worsened, or the worsening economic conditions were bad, and it all threatened to cancel out the reforms of the revolution. But in Legislative Assembly in 1791, there was a surge to go to immediate war against Austria, hoping to spread revolutionary reforms to other nations. So on April 20th, 1792, the Legislative Assembly declared war on Austria. The combined Austrian and Prussian army crossed into France. In September 1792, the National Convention abolished the monarchy and created a republic. In December 1792, Louis XVI was placed on trial. January 1793, he was executed. We saw a picture of that a few slides back with his head on the chopping block, which makes me think of the Food Network show Chopped, but definitely very different from that. Anyway, war continued. There was bad weather, food shortages, and counter-revolutions. So lots of trouble going on in France during the radical stage. The Jacobins replaced the Girondins as leaders of the National Convention in June 1793. The Jacobins wanted a strong centralized government that's rooted in Paris And they also supported temporary government controls to deal with the needs of war and their economic crisis. This won Jacobin support of the sans-culottes. The Jacobins confronted staggering problems. They had civil war that they had to face, economic distress, blockaded ports, and foreign invasion. With much at stake, the Jacobins feared that liberty and equality would perish if they failed. They felt like they had a lot riding on them. A 12-man committee of public safety served as the cabinet for convention government. It organized France's defenses, made foreign policy, supervised ministers, those are ministers of government, ordered arrest, and imposed central government's authority throughout the nation. There were several Jacobin policies. They continued to work on reform and created a new constitution in 1793 to express enthusiasm for political democracy. It gave all adult males the right to vote. Now, previously, people who did not own land or people who were illiterate couldn't vote, but this new constitution gave all adult males the right to vote. It also abolished slavery in the French colonies, and it also abolished imprisonment for debt, which was very important to those peasants who had come up through the revolution and maybe who had been imprisoned for debt. It also made plans for free public education, and we know that as more people become educated, as more knowledge is spread, more change continues to grow. So these were very forward-thinking ideas for the time. And they postponed implementation of this 1793 Constitution. Then it was never implemented, which is really sad. A lot of work and a lot of really progressive thinking went into that Constitution. The Jacobins drafted unmarried men and mobilized resources for war. They created a nation in arms inspired by patriotism, and the Jacobin phase of the revolution brought rise of modern nationalism, and they didn't understand the implications of the nationalism they unleashed. So, a lot of times we compare nationalism and patriotism. They're two very different things. The similarity is that they encourage this is really tough. All right, so nationalism and patriotism both encourage a spirit of unity. There we go. Patriotism is unity for one's country. Nationalism, however, in addition to that spirit of unity, that unification excludes people, which is what we will see later on when we start talking about Hitler and the rise of the Nazi Party and the exclusion of the Jews, or in the South, the rise of segregationists who pushed away the idea of desegregation. So you can see there is a difference between nationalism and patriotism, and at this time the Jacobins really didn't get that. So the Republic of Virtue and the Reign of Terror. Robespierre. We've talked about him a little earlier. His Committee of Public Safety waged war against internal opposition. And he was a Jacobin. He was completely committed to political democracy. He wanted to create a better society of reason, citizenship, and patriotism. Not nationalism, but patriotism. And in this Republic of Virtue, men would be free and educated, and the public good would prevail. However, he was a proponent for using terror as a way to punish enemies of the Republic. So the terror was a way of shaping New Republic society and new individuals in accordance with radical Jacobin ideology. So, here again, we talk about parading around with head on a stick, head kebab, if you will. Anyway, I would be afraid of that. I would call that terror. So the significance of terror is that, you know, did the violence indicate abandonment of reason? If this was all about reason and rationale, was terror an element of reason? Was it rational? It sounds irrational to us today. And it's hard to take a look at history sometimes because you have to remove yourself from this moment and put yourself back in their moment. Was that the best way? Was it the only way? Um, the Jacobins legalized and justified terror, and they committed it in the name of democracy. Naturally, that can't go on forever. The fall of Robespierre came about when the will to punish opponents slacked. The need for terror was abated, and Robespierre's political position weakened. People, didn't need him anymore. I guess after you've made that statement a few times with the heads on the sticks, then you've made your point. So in 1794, on July 28th, he was executed, and then 71 of his followers were also executed. After his death, the Jacobin Republic was dismantled and passed on to the Thermidorian um, bourgeoisie. And they purged the army of officers that even had the most remote sympathies for the Jacobin democracies. The new constitution came about in 1795 then. It reestablished property requirements for voting. By the end of 1795, a new Republican government faced war, sagging economy, and internal unrest. So the things that the terror fixed, decreasing the terror brought back. Doesn't mean terror is right, okay? But there again, the power began to pass down into the hands of generals, which brings us into Napoleon, who seized control of the government in 1799. So this is a drawing of Robespierre, in case you wondered what this guy looked like. I expected some really huge, mean, terrifying looking guy, maybe with pirate scars or, that sort of thing. But looks pretty civilized, looks stern, but civilized. And anyway, just wanted you to be able to see a picture of him or a drawing of him. That brings us to the end of the slides for this section, and I will see you in chapter 11, part 2.